So I think we shall start immediately. Today we're very happy and honored to have Dr. Kolja Raube from KU Leuven to deliver a very hot topic, which is related to EU-China relations. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Raube. So he is Assistant Professor of European Studies at the Faculty of Social Science at KU Leuven in Belgium. And he is also a senior researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven. And I have to mention that this lecture is an EUPLANT lecture, which is sponsored or with the support of the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. So today, Dr. Raube's presentation will be focusing on the topic of EU-China relations, a coherence perspective. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Raube. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be at least virtually in Hong Kong. I very much appreciate your kind invitation, and I would like to thank also everybody in the EUPLANT network, including Dr. Mathieu Bonnet, for making this very special lecture possible through the ongoing network that we have, which I think is a very important tool of exchange between our universities. So my topic today is EU-China relations, a coherence perspective. And I would like to basically guide you a little bit through the lecture. First, I would like to say something about coherence and EU foreign policy. I would like to then go and talk a little bit about strategic pragmatism and EU foreign policy, but also the question whether the two themes, coherence and strategy, go together easily for the European Union. Do the new clothes suit the EU? But then also to talk a little bit about the EU-China relations from a coherence perspective, and then first lessons from Kai, from the investment agreement between the European Union and China. And then I would like to conclude. So in a nutshell, coherence is the coordinated behavior where comparable and compatible methods are used in pursuit of a single objective and result in an uncontradictory foreign policy. That's a definition by Krenzler and Schneider from 1997 already, but it's still true. In a way, it's about coordination. It's about bringing different elements together to actually aim for a single objective and in a uncontradictory way. It's a negative definition, if you like. It's an absence of contradictions. It's a positive definition in the sense that it hints at the creation of synergies. And it's a goal-oriented definition, as it also hints at what is in for an actor like the European Union in terms of effectiveness, legitimacy, and credibility when it is actually using coherence. Now, there are different ways of looking at coherence in the EU and certainly in EU foreign policy. We can at least determine 4 different dimensions of coherence, the levels being vertical, horizontal, institutional, external. And depending on what kind of level of coherence you are engaging in, you will have different definitions and different examples. So for example, if you take the most obvious question of coherence, or rather incoherence, it is how the EU is able to actually bring its member states in line. How it is possible that the EU has a foreign policy that is not contradicted by member states. And very often, of course, we see that there are problems until today in that coordination effort. Another one is the horizontal level, which is basically the different policy areas that have to become aligned, where the contradiction between one policy area and another should not lead to major incoherence, such as, for example, the trade policy and development policy or foreign policy overall. There is another dimension, another level, that's the institutional level, which is probably one of the most important ones, where we have to think about how can different institutions speak the same language on topics. What is the Commission doing? What is the Council doing? But also, as a latecomer in European foreign policy, what is the European Parliament doing? And to which degree is the language that they speak actually giving a coherent choice? Now, I know that we should perhaps also speak about external coherence, and I think that's very important to take into account as well. The idea that actually external coherence is to be achieved when you are looking into how the European Union acts towards others. Ideally, it should act in the same way towards others. When you have a certain principle that you would like to achieve, you have to make sure that that principle is achieved not only in one country, but all the countries you are doing relations with. That is, of course, very ambitious, but nevertheless, we're talking about principles, and coherence itself is an objective of the treaties. It's legally enshrined in the treaties, and the European Union as a legal international organization with, of course, supranational features has to basically be ruled by the treaties. So that's very important for our background understanding. I mentioned already effectiveness, legitimacy, and credibility. So the expectations, if you talk to practitioners, but if you read also the different texts that have been produced by the European Union in terms of foreign policy, you will see that very often coherence is linked to effectiveness, that the EU is actually more effective when it has a joined up approach, when it is actually combining, for example, different policies and instruments of policies with each other to arrive at policy outcome. So in that sense, coherence increases the effectiveness of overall external action, but it also increases the legitimacy of action, because you can basically show by greater effectiveness that there is a larger output legitimacy in terms of what you have been achieving as the European Union. And when you do the things in the same way, you also gain credibility. If you are not playing, so to speak, by the same objectives across different policies, let's say, you run the risk that your partners can say, well, that's not really credible. You told us a couple of months ago that you didn't want that. So how come you have that now on the table, right? To give you one example. So there is a little bit of credibility here as well. We can also say it's credibility in terms of foreseeing what the EU is expecting from you. For certain partners closer to the European Union, this is obviously very important, but also for partners that are less geographically close to the European Union. There are, if you look into the literature, the political science, IR, European studies literature, at least 3 theoretical accounts of coherence that are all related to something that I've already said, but that come in from a certain theoretical angle. One is Normative Power Europe, so that the European Union is having certain norms and principles that it wants to basically uphold in its external action. So the idea here is the European Union is what it is, but that it wants to present certain rules, principles, values also to the world, and wants to infuse that, so to speak, in its external action. So from that perspective, coherence is important. From a Normative Power Europe perspective, coherence is important to provide arguments that persuade others why certain principles should be acceptable in the relations between the European Union and the other partner. Something that Manners has also in his text 2008 basically been argued. But he also argued the European Union has to watch out. If it wants to be persuasive, it needs to make sure that these principles are also actually upheld at home. So when you have principles in place that you are asking from others, you better make sure that these principles and values are also upheld in the European Union, because otherwise you run the risk of hypocrisy. So this is one of the theoretical ideas. Another one is administrative power Europe, or a governance approach, which is heavily based on the famous book of Ellison and Salikov on the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you basically want to think about why it matters that you have, on the one hand, a system of different actors, different organizational actors coming together, defining a foreign policy, but that need to speak in the end to the same objective. And the big question for an organization like the EU, but you can also take the governmental, so to speak, setup of every country, is how do you arrive at the situation that all your administrative parts can actually formulate one policy, and that you don't have decentralized specialization, that you don't have compartmentalization, that is rather perhaps leading towards a more split, let's say, foreign policy. So if you want to have coherence from that perspective, it is important that you overcome compartmentalization and that you can actually pull the forces of your administration together to arrive at greater output legitimacy. From a realist perspective, the EU always looked, let's say, a little bit pitiful, because from that perspective, it was always the member states that determined anyways which direction the European Union would go. And in that sense, incoherence is likely to be the natural situation, because every state will try to achieve its own goals from a realist perspective. So the EU tries to bring the member states together, but from a realist perspective, yeah, it's doomed to basically fail in that exercise. It's interesting, though, that the old, let's say, realist school within European studies hasn't really, perhaps I'm saying a bit too much now, thought about what is actually happening if the EU becomes itself more strategic and more of a realist player. So one of the alternatives here could be that the EU is actually uniting the member states in a realist approach towards the outside world, and thus becoming more coherent. So when we look at joined up European foreign policy, sorry for the typo here, it would mean that the European foreign policy tries to develop a foreign policy in which all the different elements of external action are represented, including also the European neighborhood policy, development cooperation, and internal policies, or for that matter, very importantly for the European Union, external financing instruments. But what is also important is that we look into another dimension of coherence, and that is perhaps the dimension that rather runs against the idea of coherence in the European Union, and that is further strategic pragmatism. Strategic pragmatism that we have been seeing developing over the years, at least from 2016 onwards, with the global strategy of the European Union. Thanks to external crisis that Anna Junkers is hinting at here in this quote, the European Union has been adapting. has been adapting to a strategy that is much more also focusing on what could be our pragmatic responses to the different crises that we are experiencing in external relations. And in that sense, try to come up with what she and others, including the global strategy, have called a resilience paradigm to making the European Union resilient, but also other actors with whom the European Union is actually working with. And to arrive at that resilience, you need principled pragmatism. You need, so the global strategy goes, you need to make very clear when you are going to take pragmatic decisions. But these pragmatic decisions, the global strategy says, need to follow certain principles, at least in theory. And that's where the whole debate starts. And I present here a couple of quotes from the text of Anna Junkers, which I find is still one of the best texts on the topic, where she basically says, well, you can't basically have both. You cannot have pragmatism and a principled foreign policy at the same time. The two will always lead to inconsistency and further incoherence of the European Union. Because it will be very difficult to basically say, this is a pragmatic decision that completely follows our idea of a strategic response, while at the same time having a principled decision that can stick to your own norms and values that you should ideally have in all your foreign policy action. These two run somehow against each other. So what we get is, so to speak, this situation where you have two different pairs of clothes, and the question is, do the two pairs match? Is there sufficient, so to speak, a consistency between these two ideas, the idea of coherence and the idea of strategy? So on the one hand, the EU expects coherence to be leading to effective, legitimate, and credibility. And the literature on coherence has mostly taken up these general expectations and failed to question whether coherence can be seen as a virtue in general, I would say. But at the same time, the debate is moving on. And we see now that the EU is actually adapting to a changing international environment, and thus leading the EU to bring in much more the idea of principled pragmatism and strategy. So in a text that actually Mathieu Bonnet and myself have been writing in an article for Global Affairs a couple of years ago, we somehow pinpoint how coherence would lead to greater internal and external legitimacy, and what it would imply, including the orchestration of different institutions and policies, and how at the same time, when you follow the more strategic impetus of the European Union that the EU has been choosing over the last couple of years, how you also need coordinated action, but that it is very likely that you arrive at greater inconsistencies, compartmentalization, and the question is to a certain extent whether you can arrive at external, let's say, credibility. We rather say that you win external recognition, but that your partners may no longer necessarily agree with everything that you do. So you become a much, let's say, strategized actor that needs to be recognized for what it does, but you're not necessarily always on the same page with your partners. So to basically sum, so to speak, that up, I think the European Union has increasingly focused on strategic responses over the last couple of years to tackle the manifold challenges that it faces in global affairs. And the EU's global strategy 2016, but also the connectivity strategy that it has produced 2019 kind of speak that language. Of strategizing ambitions of the European Union in the context of environment changes in the international environment. The question is, of course, how you deliver coherence, because coherence hasn't been erased from the treaties. It's still an objective in the treaties of the European Union. And just to be clear, principled pragmatism is not. Principled pragmatism is a political choice, and coherence is actually an objective, a legal objective in the treaty. So how do you deal with these two together? And what does it mean for EU-China relations? I think when we come to EU-China relations in that perspective, it is also important to, of course, look at the greater picture, at the international picture, the power struggle that we see emerging between the US and China on the one hand, and the question, how does Europe, so to speak, act in that regard? The increased, so to speak, relationship over the last couple of months, again, between the EU and the United States, where people talk about the so-called Biden moment, and the question of course, the global context, what is the EU doing bilaterally in its relations with China? The foreign policy context, as I mentioned before, was one very much determined over the last couple of years through the idea in the global strategy of principled pragmatism to bring, so to speak, more strategy together with principles. And we see in a way that more strategic approach of the European Union is also resembled in certain documents that deal with China from an EU perspective, such as the EU-China strategy or the communication from March 2019, where the EU has pointed at China as a systemic rival and economic competitor. So the two things are always somehow going together, to look at China as a partner, on the one hand, a partner in multilateralism, a partner to actually advance in certain fields of multilateralism. But at the same time, the European Union is also looking at China as what it calls a systemic rival and economic competitor. Probably the last would also hold true for the United States, that the EU would say, well, if we look at it from an economic point of view, the United States is an economic competitor for us. But the question is, of course, how do you bring that element together with the idea of partnering on certain multilateral issues, and how you are engaging, excuse me, with each other much more from that, so to speak, position of rivalry. What is also important is that we understand the European Union's attempt to focus on foreign policy from a trade perspective, to actually work on bilateral and multilateral arenas of trade at the same time, with the preference at the moment for bilateral arrangements, as you know, because of the difficulties that the multilateral trade system is going through. And last but not least, since we are talking about principles all the time, the European Union has a foreign policy that is heavily still focused on human rights and democracy, with a roadmap in the context of the democracy and human rights plan, the new plan for the years 2019-2024, where basically we also saw, in relation to that human rights and democracy action plan, the introduction of a new framework of restrictive measures that the European Union starts to be using. So the lessons from the CHI, to come back to the question of coherence, is that we saw perhaps for some of the observers a little bit surprisingly these last-minute attempts of the German presidency in January to really push for the CHI, and it was possible to arrive at the CHI, at the investment agreement, which very much speaks to the idea of China as an economic competitor with whom you deal, right? With whom you make deals, and in both interests. And in that sense, it's also clearly speaking to the overall, let's say, strategy of the European Union on trade policy. The Commission was in the lead, but clearly also during the German presidency with a push from that side. However, the CHI was always scrutinized and criticized by other institutions, and that's the institutional coherence that comes in, that I introduced earlier in the discussion. How do you deal with that in the case of the European Union? You can imagine that the European Parliament has always been on a couple of issues being more critical than other actors in the European Union. And then we see the sanction practice of the European Union that somehow looks completely incoherent. That you are at the same time having an agreement, and you are in the midst of the ratification process, sanctioning your partner on issues that have been seen as not tolerable from the side of the European Union. And here the big question is, of course, which kind of incoherence are we talking about, and which kind of coherence what we have expected? I think if we look at the European Union, they have issued in the CHI agreement as well certain aspects that deal with principles of the European Union, but not as provokingly as it was in the sanction practice that followed in March. So there is seemingly a difference between the approach taken, let's say, in the trade area and in the foreign policy area overall, which looks like at least a let's say a horizontal incoherence on the side of the European Union. And of course, with the retaliation measures by China, the European Union is also now in a situation where China, I would argue, has deliberately chosen to single out to a certain degree the European Parliament, to react and to perhaps even facilitate further incoherence by the European Parliament, because it was very much likely that the European Parliament would, so to speak, stop the ratification process as a consequence. And in fact, that is what was likely to be happening, and that is also what happened now later in May. The European Parliament has been officially, so to speak, putting the ratification on hold. It has frozen it. The issue, the lesson of Kai, I think, is an important one, and that is that the decision-making structure in the European Union includes different actors. We've been seeing that in the making of the Kai, and what we've been seeing as well is that in parallel, other actors are deciding on other issues, such as human rights related issues, and opted for sanction practices that to a large extent, of course, fired back into, let's say, the realm of the Kai agreement. And in a way, what we see as a consequence is that we are in a new, let's say, situation, a situation where we could argue that we have two strands of coherence running against each other. The one is the kind of realist coherence, where or the realist expectation of coherence, where you basically say it's absolutely normal under new conditions of strategizing that the EU is looking inconsistent because it is compartmentalized. On the one hand, you have different institutions, but you have also different member states that still dictate to a certain degree the direction of the European Union. So Kai, you could argue, was in the end very much pushed by some strategic interests, not only of the European Union overall, based on its trade agenda, but also of certain member states that wanted Kai to be happening. And that is, of course, Germany. And we also heard, of course, from Angela Merkel, even after the sanctioning measures of the European Union and the retaliation measures of China, that Kai would come. So she still had and has the belief and the hope that the Kai can be ratified. At the same time, though, you have this issue of normative coherence, where you have certain actors that play and also certain institutions that still play very much by the principles and the norms of the European Union. And that sits in a way square to the ambitions of actually the Kai ratification. So the question is what actually is dividing, so to speak, Europe, and how you can unite EU institutions towards a coherent, pragmatic, and principled strategic action. And I guess that will be a big question. I think the two, as Mathieu Bernet and myself expected already in 2018, the two are increasingly running against each other. You have certain strategic approaches, and perhaps we could also even ask the question whether the normative approach is becoming the new strategic approach of the European Union, in a similar way to what we also see these days from the Biden administration in the US. Very lastly, on the end of the Kai, is it the end? Well, it's not the end. The EP has frozen it. But if you look at the passing votes that I represent here on my slide, they are quite over, they reach over all the fractions and caucuses in the European Parliament. It's been a large vote actually in favor of freezing the ratification of the Kai. And the question is, of course, how it can be overcome. So in a way, my last point here is that next to all the other challenges that I tried to allude to through that coherence perspective, the largest and perhaps the most interesting one to look at is now to which degree there is a vertical coherence, a coherence between the EU's interest that is now articulated through its sanctioning practice, and through the European Parliament as well, next to the first signing of the KAI and the particular interests of member states, especially Germany, but also others, to still make KAI happen. And to which degree, so to speak, that kind of coherence needs to be found and can be found between the EU level on the one hand and now the particular member state interests. So thank you very much for your attention. And I hope I haven't talked for too long.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Raube, for your wonderful presentation. I do actually learn a lot because I'm actually a traditional lawyer, so this is something that really interests me, and I feel puzzled for the past few years to see, you know, China and EU, they have this, you know, struggle, and now I know a little bit more about the situation now. So I would like to open the floor to questions. So if anyone that wish to have raise a question, then probably then we could have an hour to do that. Okay. So are there any questions? So Professor Ling Feng is actually the organizer of a sponsor in the CDU here. So Professor Ling Feng, I think he has a question.
Yes, thank you, Chen Chang, and thank you, Dr. Raube, for giving the very interesting lecture. I have two questions here for you. And one is in the EU foreign policy. I just wonder now whether the traditional economic theory, that's to emphasize the comparative advantage in the international trade, that different countries in trading are supposed to use each other's comparative advantage to complement each other. So to what extent that policy is still relevant in the EU's foreign policy, or is its effect is dwindling these years? So that's one question. The second question is somehow related. From what you've said, the European Parliament's voting 599 to 30. So does that represent that the principles essentially prevail over the pragmatism in EU, not only in the Parliament, but also Council and other institutions? Can it be interpreted in that way? Yeah, those are my two questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor. And I think they are very important questions. So, and they are not easy to be answered. I count also on the help of others in the audience who like to complement my answer. But I think when I take your first question on the competitive advantage and to which degree, in a way, the cooperation of partners still matters to arrive at that competitive advantage. Excuse me. I think it's very important to understand that I think the European Union is still driven by that logic. It's very much, if you would ask practitioners these days, the first answer would be, if we could, we would use the WTO to do that. And since we can't that easily, we are doing things bilaterally over the last years, but we are looking for what they call connectivity. We are looking for an approach that allows us to, in all the competition that we have with each other, to find ways to cooperate and to actually excel through the competition and the cooperation that we have. I think that's the whole logic also of signing the investment agreement, to see what are the mutual benefits on the one hand, what are the particular benefits for the EU, but also what are the particular benefits for China. And I think there is an agreement that you cannot have it all, but there is an agreement that actually in the long run, agreements like these are the ones that lead to more competition, but that the competition will in the end be actually an advantage on both sides. So I think that is the overarching logic that you see, and let's also not forget who is pushing for that. I think that's another important aspect. There are certain economic interests represented by major companies, enterprises in the European Union who see their advantages through that lens as well. And I think they have been very much pushing and waiting for the agreement to come. So I think in that sense, EU trade policy is certainly driven by that logic. The question is how you embed that logic in an overarching EU foreign policy, and that's the whole question of coherence. It's if DG Trade in the European Commission was responsible for the whole European foreign policy, I think then it would be clear that something that happened this spring may have not have happened. But we have different actors. You have different actors that are also having other interests and that are pushing not only for the ideas of, as you called it, competitive advantage, or for the idea of actually closer trade relations, but that are also pushing for other issues, including the more principles and values of the European Union. And the question is how you bring these two together. And that brings me to the second question that you had. What prevails? If we look at the decision, and I think what is happening is, from that coherence perspective again, that coherence wasn't found. So there is no coherent position of the European Union. So you see on the one hand that end of January we have the signature on the CAI, and then a couple of months, 2 months later, we have the sanction practice. So that's not very coherent. But it is coherent in each of these silos. It is coherent, so to speak, it's consistent in each of these silos. It's consistent in the trade silo that you signed the agreement, and it's consistent from those who have been ongoingly working from an EU perspective. It's consistent for those who have been working on, let's say, human rights related issues. And they said, we have to take that action. The problem is they don't, well, I'm exaggerating now, but they give the impression they don't speak with each other. And perhaps that's something we need to do research on. We need to understand better what is the logic. What is the logic of that incoherence? Is that a deliberate incoherence? Is that a deliberate incoherence of what Mathieu Bonnet calls compartmentalization of European foreign policy? That you basically increasingly run, so to speak, in parallel policies that have different objectives, and that in the end are basically avoiding exactly what you pointed at, that one would prevail over the other. That you rather have, let's say, policies that are, overarchingly perhaps inconsistent, that don't match, but that somehow find their way, and that will somehow still be able to be acceptable. I'm not sure, however, how this is going to evolve now. I think a best scenario is in a way that nobody loses face. Yeah. So that you can still have a scenario where all the trade interests are met and where all the, let's say, interests from those who promote the principles of the EU are met. But how do you bring these two together? That's very difficult under the current situation, I guess.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So probably I would take the privilege to ask a small, very related question. Is that I think that what I learned from EU is that it started from an economical organization or union, right? So people are doing these united things just to promote economic development. I know that later that there are certain values being added up, but as far as I can see, the policy related to such concepts as internal market, single market, something like that, is very dominant in terms of the EU dialogues relating to even related to foreign policy. So I was thinking why this will happen. Like Professor Lin has just mentioned that the vote is overwhelming in that sense. So isn't that comes from an economic rationale, or is that purely coming from like principle, like a perspective that you just mentioned? Is it that thing that they will not benefit from this agreement, or is that they think that even though they can benefit a lot, but there are things that cannot be negotiated? So I just want to hear a very short answer from you. Thanks.
If you meant the last vote of the European Parliament, right? Yeah, I think that's another dimension, though. I think that is really now a vote that you can best explain from an institutional perspective, and that is that the retaliation of China has hit directly the European Parliament, even committees in the European Parliament, and even individual members, and that's basically when the stop sign goes up and the European Parliament says, no, we can't accept that. I think that's an institutional, that also explains why the large majority behind that vote is spanning across different fractions, even fractions that are very pro-integration, pro-economic integration and pro-international trade. This vote includes all the EPP, all the liberals that would normally be, very, very much in favor of the KAI, and that's an institutional decision. It's an institutional decision of the European Parliament to basically say we have an autonomy as an institution to take decisions, and our members cannot be sanctioned. It cannot be sanctioned. That's basically the reaction of the European Parliament. So I would also explain that perhaps one additional question, additional remark, with the growing, let's say, feeling of power that the European Parliament has over these matters. This parliament is different from the parliament before the Lisbon Treaty, and it's different from the parliament before the Nice Treaty and before the Amsterdam and Maastricht Treaty. It has grown, it has increased its power, and it is a strong actor that perceives itself on an equal footing with the European Commission and the Council. And in all areas, even in those areas where legal scholars would tell you that the role of the European Parliament is not as influential as in other areas. But it doesn't matter for the European Parliament. The Parliament just thinks of itself in that way. And the institutional response had to be that way from the European Parliament's perspective.
Okay, thanks. So sorry, Matthew, I know that you have a question. Yes, please. Yes.
No need to apologize at all, Chen Chang, and good afternoon slash morning, everyone. Thank you, Kolja, for this presentation, and many thanks indeed to Professor Lin and Professor He for organizing this very interesting lecture. I would have I have a very long list of questions, but I'll stick to two questions at this stage, Kolja, if I may, which are both related to coherence here. And the first question, I would like here to provoke you a little bit, and I would like to propose that the CAI, as it stands or as it stood when it was indeed concluded in principle back in December 2020, did actually enhance the coherence in the EU's external action. It did enhance the EU's coherence in its external action for the simple reason that we have in the CAI a section 4, which indeed, provides a certain level of protection in terms not only of labor rights, but also in terms of environmental protection. And what we should not underestimate is the fact that now with the CAI being frozen, we are not left with anything. We are left with 25 bilateral investment treaties between EU member states and China, BITs, which do not include, provisions aimed to protect labor rights nor the environment. The simple reason is that we are talking here about older generation BITs, which did not include this kind of comprehensive approach towards investment agreements and did only bother with the protection of foreign investors. So in that sense, can we argue that the CAI was indeed a way to enhance the promotion of not only the EU's interests, the idea of further liberalizing investment flows between China and the EU, but was also in a way strengthening the promotion of some of the values included in Article 21 of the Lisbon Treaty, namely the promotion of sustainable development and the promotion of labor rights. So that would be my first question. Then my second question again relates to coherence and to what I would see as the simultaneous adoption of a variety of instruments at both bilateral and also unilateral levels. What I'm referring here is, how do you read the simultaneous negotiations of bilateral agreements such as the CAI on the one side, whose first purpose is indeed to further deepen the liberalization of investment flows between the EU and China, and at the same time, the adoption by the EU of a number of unilateral instruments such as an investment screening mechanism aimed to protect the EU's national security, but also a number of unilateral instruments such as the global human rights sanction regime, the so-called Magnitsky-style rules, which were adopted by the EU early December. Or I'm also thinking of the European Parliament's work on a resolution that would be aimed at enhancing corporate due diligence and corporate responsibility in the area of human rights, which would again add, if you like, yet another obstacle, if you want to call it that way, against the further liberalization of investment flow. So what we do see are two trends which function in parallel to each other. And my question is this what principled pragmatism is all about? You promote your interest by liberalizing investments through the negotiation of the CAI, but at the same time, you add some kind of safeguards through the adoption of a number of unilateral instruments, such as those Magnitsky-style rules or sanction regime, and indeed the work of the European Parliament on corporate due diligence on the other side. So these would be my two questions. Thank you, Kolja.
Thanks a lot, Mathieu. And perhaps I start with the first question. I think the first question is really good, and I would agree. I would agree that actually the CAI brought together different issues from different so-called areas of EU external action in the framework of a trade and investment agreement that was mainly run by DG Trade. Yeah, so it's good news for horizontal coherence, and it's good news for institutional coherence, because seemingly they must have talked to other DGs, yeah, and they must have also talked to the External Action Service, and seemingly they were able to negotiate that with a very strong partner, China. So you can say, well done, right? You achieved a certain level of coherence, not that it's perhaps the ultimate level that you would expect, but you know, you have to take into account that it is, of course, an agreement that had also its limits because of the different perspectives on the European side and the Chinese side. So I think you can argue, as you did, that in the first phase, there was an enhancement of coherence in that regard. But the paradoxical situation is that that seemingly was, I wouldn't say killed, but undermined in a second phase. Where, and here the question is that intended? Was that intended? Or was that basically simply a non-coordination of different institutions that were running in parallel? And that's something that we have to, I think, we have to do research about. What explains the action of the European Union in that second phase? Because clearly, as you pointed out, there is a lack of coherence. The question is whether the EU deliberately took into account that it would be incoherent with the agreement. And I think that is the major question. So first question, I agree with you, but I think we have to look at it in these two different phases and what happened to coherence in these two different phases. Second one, it's a very interesting observation, huh? And I think it's very interesting to basically also perhaps indeed make sense of what principled pragmatism could be about. That on the one hand, you are trying to achieve a more or less coherent agreement that is coherent on the vertical level because member states wanted it. It is coherent institutionally. It's coherent horizontally because different areas come into play. But then, you know, you have, so to speak, a second trump in your backhand. That's your strategic trump. And that is that you take a bit of unilateral action that even runs the risk of undermining the agreement. And here, and that is, I think, the question: are these unilateral moves of the European Union still in line with the agreement, or are these unilateral moves in the end incoherent moves because they also fundamentally go against the nature of the agreement itself? If I understand you correctly, you have doubts whether on some of these issues, perhaps the unilateral action even is going against the nature of the agreement. And if that is the case, then well, then this I would say is really problematic because then the European Union is not only strategically playing unilateral instruments, but then it is also risking to actually use credibility in the face of its external partner. Because that is something that you definitely want to avoid, right? Everybody will say, okay, you have a second set of instruments, that's fine, that's your trump, everybody does that. But I think you run the risk that actually the credibility of yourself is undermined if the substance of the agreement itself is undermined by your action.
Okay, thanks for your answer. And I hope that satisfies you, Matthew. So
definitely does. Thank you.
Sure. So are there any more questions? We can take one more if there are any. And if not, I think the time is just right. I would like to thank you very much for Dr. Raube for your wonderful presentation. I think not just me, but all the audience here, they actually learn a lot from your presentation. And hereby I conclude this presentation, and I thank you very much for participating in this wonderful event. Thanks very much.
And thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Professor Lin and Professor He.
Thank you, Matthew.